Good afternoon, and thank you for your patience. We've all experienced some glitches with technology sometimes. Welcome back to Planet Native 2022. My name is Stacia Stelk, and I'm the Executive Director of Deep Roots. Deep Roots and its partners organized Planet Native to help build our collective capacity for creating and maintaining healthy, successful native plant landscapes throughout our communities. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's sessions and are looking forward to today's. Without our sponsors, we could not bring you Planet Native. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and to our gold sponsors, DCA, Colonial Gardens, and Miller Hammond Charitable Fund. Special thanks to our silver sponsors, Evergy, the Missouri Department of Conservation, Missouri Wildflower Nursery, Gale Hart Communities, Montage Liberty, and Casey Parks. And finally, thank you to our bronze sponsors, Forest Keeling, the Mark Water Quality Education Committee, Print Forest, Red River Valley Design, So Wild Natives, Vireo, Honeywild Farms, and Taylor Creek Restoration Nursery. Yesterday, I thanked our staff, and today I want to thank the volunteers who make Deep Roots and Planet Native possible. Thank you to our planning committee members and the volunteers who stepped up to MC this week. Noelle Benyon, Stacy Davis, Chris DeLong, Margot Farnsworth, Hunter Gale, Kathy Gates, Christina Hoxie, Linda Lairbaum, Larry O'Donnell, Eric Chance, and Stephen Van Ryn. These folks joined us to seek great content, find inspirational speakers, and even to test technology. Could have used a little bit more of that apparently today. As with everything Deep Roots does, we are nothing without our great partners and volunteer leaders. Thank you. I am lucky I get to work with you. You teach me, inspire me, and most importantly, you make me laugh every day. Before I introduce today's keynote speaker, I want to remind you to take advantage of the chat feature on the right side of your screen. I already see it populating, so thank you. And if you have any questions or comments as we go along, please feel free to add them there. This afternoon, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Dr. Roberts is a tenured associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is also the founder and director of the Public Health Outcomes and Effects of the Built Environment Laboratory, as well as the co-founder and co-director of Nature RX at UMD. It's an initiative that emphasizes the green space benefits interspersed throughout and around the University of Maryland campus and acknowledges the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, as well as the historical slave trade legacies on the UMD campus land. Her scholarship focuses on the impact of built, social, and natural environments, including the institutional and structural inequities of these environments on the public health outcomes of marginalized communities. Most of her research has explored the dynamic relationships between environmental, social, and cultural determinants of the physical activity to infer complex health outcome patterns and disparities among adults and children. A native of Buffalo, New York, Dr. Roberts received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Brown University. She holds a Master of Public Health degree from Emory University, Rollins School of Public Health, and earned her Doctor of Public Health from Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I actually am going to be sharing a presentation, and I first want to say that I'm really, really thrilled to be speaking with all of you. I want to thank Tammy Thompson of Deep Roots, Casey, and everyone at the conference for inviting me to be one of your keynote speakers for this year's Planet Native Conference, Planet Native Landscapes Conference. And so the title of the presentation that I'm going to actually be giving today is called The Secret Life of Plants, a celebration of nature's gifts to humankind. If you were able to take a look at the abstract for this presentation, you would have seen that the title for the talk was inspired by Stevie Wonder's 1979 album titled Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants, which was actually a soundtrack for a documentary of the same name. This talk is subsequently divided into 5 parts, and each part leads with title and lyric quote for one of the songs of the actual album. And I thought recognizing this album by one of my favorite artists for a talk about nature was quite appropriate. Also, I'm going to be focused today talking about or highlighting the African American consciousness or experiences as related to nature and natural environments. And I'm going to talk about this historically as well as contemporarily. So, I actually wanted to show you guys a clip. This is a clip of about 3 minutes, and it's a video, and it really could really stimulate the senses because it really, you hear birds, you hear all of the natural sounds, and actually it's a video that talks about the Atkins Arboretum, and it talks about how that was pivotal in the Underground Railroad, and specifically the actual land and the course that Harriet Tubman took from Eastern Shore, Maryland to Philadelphia and the road to freedom. And even though it's slightly out of order in terms of the chronological things I'm going to talk about today, I thought this was going to be a great video to actually kind of soak in and hear and see some of those kind of aspects of nature. But in any case, I will start from the beginning and talk about the very beginning when bodies were actually pilfered from Africa and brought to America, or what was to become the United States of America. And really kind of recognize that when these men and women were taken, they were taken from a land where they had a very intimate relationship with nature. They were hunter-gatherers, they were farmers, they were herders. And consequently, as enslaved persons, they had to develop a brand new relationship with nature. Nearly every aspect of their bonded experience put them into direct contact with the natural environment. And they use the natural environment for everything, using for navigation. So, for example, sun using to navigate, northwest, even using moss on trees to navigate the difference between, the moss that was damp was facing north versus the moss that was dry was facing south. So every aspect of nature they were able to use and kind of enrich their understanding of their new environment. And so we have this new African American population that were able to develop their uses of nature, which really just became a hybrid of the African traditions that they brought with them, and many of the things they developed and learned just through these new conditions of bondage. Everything from using cornrows to transmit messages. So cornrows, which have African origins, proved to be really efficient and life-saving when they wanted to transmit messages to each other without letting the enslavers know what they were trying to transmit messages. And many of these intricate hairstyles would show kind of like maps and routes. So if you wanted to escape, you could share how to navigate with another fellow person. Also, the cornrows were used to be able to carry foods during your escape. So they would carry, rice and seeds for nourishment on the long journey. Another aspect that's also been told in a lot of the stories is how the phrase hush puppies came from. So when enslaved persons were running away, they knew that the hound dogs were going to be on their tail. And so they would often take these hush puppy foods that they would cook and actually put strychnine in. And so when they knew the dogs were on their tail, they would just send this favorite food, and then subsequently the dog would be hushed. Also, we had maroon communities that were created during this enslaved period. They were formed because you had folks who were runaways, but they didn't want to go all the way north, but they knew they did not want to be enslaved on these plantations anymore. So they wanted to permanently leave the plantation. And so with their ability to find food and shelter in the kind of uncultivated areas that surrounded the plantation, they were able to live deep in the woods or swamps for many years and even generations. And Subsequently, scholars have kind of divided the groups into borderland maroons who were not quite as independent. They were independent in the South that they left the plantation, but oftentimes they would come back to the plantation to secure resources, or they would sneak back on, I should say, or see loved ones, whereas the hinterland maroons were completely independent. They had a completely different society. They were completely inaccessible to their enemies, and they ultimately had the greatest level of autonomy. And many of these communities were most common in Georgia, Louisiana, Virginia, and the Carolinas. And so up north, I think I have a slide missing, but that's okay. We have this period where, we fast forward, and now, the Civil War has occurred, and despite the end of slavery and the declaration that African Americans were U.S. citizens and they now had this right to vote, they were still really in this really kind of disenfranchised kind of conditions. And this was primarily through black codes and sharecropping. And so what we see here is that black codes are just really restrictive laws that really just limited the freedom of African Americans and ensured that they would still be available as a cheap labor force. And this was also done the sharecropping system, where they ultimately kept these newly freed persons in this kind of perpetual state of poverty. Also during this time, you had this increase in white supremacy that was growing rampant. And between 1882 and 1968, there were over 3,400 lynchings of African Americans. And so because of this, you had, I'm sorry, my slides seem to be out of order, but I'm trying to just kind of fly by the seat of my pants. We had many African Americans who actually subsequently left the actual South. And this is known as the actual Great Migration. This occurred in two waves. Primarily, you had the first migration that was probably between 1950 and 1940, and then you had your second migration between 1940 and 1970. And they left primarily in hope for, a better existence, hope for, more liberation. And so it was a big switch, because what you had was a lot of folks left the South, where you had these nature-filled communities, environments, to now this urban situation where folks were living in these cramped and dilapidated housing. They were segregated, through racial covenants. The employment conditions were better in the sense that they actually were getting paid as opposed to being a sharecropper, but they were often dangerous because now they were working in factories, and again, they were no longer outdoors working on farms. So a lot of these things actually changed their situation, in the sense that now they're living in this kind of very urban area that is kind of keeping them away from nature in many regards. However, there was, the Washington Park. So if I back up a little bit, Chicago was probably one of the most common destinations during the Great Migration. Richard Wright, who is a prolific author of novels, short stories, and poems, he migrated from to Chicago during the Great Migration. And he talked about this experience in his novel called Black Boy. And he stated in a quote in that book, he said, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown, to the warmth of other suns." And that last part may be familiar to you, because there was a book that was written by that using that same phrase. But what he noted once he got to Chicago was that it was now this area, there were no curves, there were no trees, only angles and lines. However, the one respite was Washington Park. And this was an area that was supposed to be the quote antithesis to the city's bustling, paved, rectangular, walled-in streets. And here you have actually this very small area of the Black Belt that occurred in 1920. It was a small area that was from State Street to Cottage Grove and from 22nd to 60th Street. And over time, it expanded. But in 1920, there was only about 15% of African Americans who lived there. The park, which was actually landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, it was, had pastoral green lawns and wooded paths. And it was a great natural escape for many of the African American migrants who really missed their southern natural spaces. By 1930, it expanded, and you see that it expanded partly because, hemmed by the racial restrictive covenants of the time, African Americans were largely confined to limited sections of the city, and the housing near Washington Park was among the best quality to them. And so by 1930, they grew from only being about 15% in the neighborhood to now 90% of the actual residents. And so the Chicago Black Belt continued to expand. As we can see, all the way through the 1940s, it expanded greatly. But subsequently, they were targeted. Many of the white residents who were already living there really resented this large influx, and they were targeted in these public green and blue spaces, particularly when these spaces were shared by both races and actually were living in neighborhoods that were undergoing these racial transitions. And one such incident happened in July of 1919 when an African American teenager by the name of Eugene Williams, he drowned in Lake Michigan after he was violating a quote unofficial segregation of Chicago's beaches, and being stoned by a group of white people who were there. And because of his death, and actually also due to the fact that police refused to arrest the white people involved, this sparked a week of racial riots. And this was one of the signature events that occurred due to the Red Summer of 1919. And I have to apologize again because for some reason I had some other slides in here to talk about the Red Summer of 1919. And it seems as if the slides are missing. But in any case, this Red Summer was actually a period of massive violence that occurred between April and November throughout the nation. There were approximately 25 riots, 97 recorded lynchings. The membership of KKK increased really into the millions. And this racial violence happened all throughout the city. And the most violent episodes were in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and then what also is known as the Elaine Massacre, which also occurred where there was over 200 African American men, women, and children who actually were killed in Elaine, Arkansas. But moving back to Chicago, we see how, and now in 1960, how this area of the Black Belt was also subsequently completely engulfed Washington Park, and how it's expanded so much more. So this slide, which is the slide that I had wanted to mention earlier, was a slide that I actually wanted to make note of the fact that there were African Americans who were free up north during the time of slavery. And Seneca Village was actually this remote village that was in New York State. And it was probably by about 1855, there were about 225 residents. And it was an autonomous community within nature that was separate from Manhattan. So you had many, many different African Americans who were free, who were able to live in this village. And you also had some Irish and some German immigrants who lived here. But everyone lived harmoniously within this natural environment. And it was a great 5-acre area that had streets and churches, and many of the people were homeowners. And it was great to escape the city ills of Manhattan and many of the racism that people experienced within the city. And so you had many people, again, who were homeowners, who also, you had abolitionists like the Lions, who, they worked and they educated the people within the actual village. But unfortunately, the land was expropriated for the construction of Central Park, and it completely destroyed the entire village. And what we see here is where Seneca Village once was, but now we have this, what is known as Central Park, again, landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted. And it's interesting because he had good intentions to supply, quote, the hundreds of thousands of Thai workers, but because of where it was located, it was really only catered to the upper class elite because it was nowhere in location to the working class people of the city. So this next section, I can't really promise you what the section is because I've just kind of been flying by the seat of my pants because the slides kind of obviously are in a different order. But I'm moving forward to current day. So what we see today is that if we back up and we look in probably the summer of 2020, where we all were really at the beginning of feeling that lockdown, CDC really encouraged us. They even put on their website, they said, visiting parks close to your home is a safe way to get outside and also to protect yourself and others from contracting COVID-19. But unfortunately, almost half of us don't have a park within a 10-minute walk to our home. And the size and the quality of parks are highly correlated with neighborhood demographics. And so what we saw that some parks were getting overcrowded. So in essence, they were doing the reverse. People were no longer able to physically distance themselves. And so the parks were subsequently closed. And so what we were able to really see was that there was really some nature inequities that really came to light during the beginning era of this particular pandemic. And we see that the quality of parks, is highly correlated with neighborhood demographics. And this is a pattern that is repeated across the U.S., where the nicest parks tend to be in the wealthiest and wider neighborhoods. And this is according to the Trust for Public Land, which is a nonprofit land access advocacy group. And here's an example of a woman. Her name is Roquetta Dotley, and she lives in an apartment in South Chattanooga, and it's right next to this really small neighborhood park that you can't see because actually this was an animated slide. So underneath the writing, you could see her neighborhood. But in any case, the park is very small, and also it's shoehorned next to this industrial plant that produces cellulose plant and biofuels factory using lard and animal grease. So it doesn't probably have very most pleasant odors as well. But 4 miles away, you see Coolidge Park. And Coolidge Park, as you can see, has these sprawling, the lands and the trees. And it's very beautiful, as you can see from the photo. But what's interesting, where Roquetta lives, it's 95% African Americans, whereas where Coolidge Park is bookends by two neighborhoods, one that's like 75% white residents and the other that's 96% white residents. And so in order for us to really understand these kind of differences, we have to really look at the intricacies of the policies and the practices that were put in place and sanctioned by federal and local governments that still have impacts today. So everything from redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal really had a lasting effect on how and where African Americans live within their built social and their natural environments, and the subsequent health disparities that they experience is related to the exposure or lack of exposure to those environments. And so one example that we see is in regard to nature. Again, communities of color are almost 3 times more likely than white communities to live in nature-deprived areas. And some of this is directly related to the impacts of specifically urban renewal, where you have this proliferation of highways being constructed throughout cities that pretty much decimated many African American neighborhoods and displaced many African Americans from their homes. And so, again, as it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm from Buffalo, New York. And when I was a young girl, my mom used to always talk about when she was young, and how she loved walking down Humboldt Parkway. And I never really paid attention to what she was talking about because she was always talking about it. And I was like, yeah, yeah. But I didn't really appreciate it until I started to do research and scholarship in this area of work, looking at urban renewal and suburbanization, how that impacts or has impacted our environments. And so you can see in the top photo, that's a photo from 1912 where there was Humboldt Parkway. Again, that was landscaped and designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And then the present day, you see the highway. And if you look, you can really juxtapose these photos and see how this Highway 33 pretty much decimated and destroyed one of the natural treasures of Buffalo, in the sense that there was Humboldt Parkway and now there's this highway. Also, we have to think about the relationship between residential inequity, or specifically racist city planning, and how that's related to nature and equity. So historic racism in housing practices and city planning and institutions really shaped residential settlement patterns, and that's been documented for decades. And so, for example, with redlining, where we had areas where people were racially or ethnically deemed undesirable were excluded from certain areas. And so these red line areas, they were considered hazardous, because they had either African Americans or maybe poor white immigrants. Whereas you had the A areas that were outlined in green, they were suitable for investment. So suitable for investment, what does that mean? That means beautification of planting trees, landscaping, planting flowers, creating parks. And so you had all of these A areas that were really beautified by these really wonderful parks. So again, this is a red line map, or homeowner loan corporation security map of, again, my hometown, Buffalo. This is from 1937. And as you can see, Delaware Park, which is another one of our city treasures, it's over a 350-acre park, again, landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted. You can see where it's kind of, encapsulated by the kind of blue and green areas, as opposed to the areas more towards the south, which is more red. There is a lack of parks. And so when we think about nature is beneficial to health and well-being. That could be another whole level of a presentation. But when folks don't have equitable access to nature in these natural spaces, there will also be inequitable health outcomes. And so one example is with heat exposure. So when there's less green space, there's often more heat. And using an example of Richmond, Virginia, we can see that areas that were formerly redlined have significantly less tree cover compared to areas that were not redlined. And as a result of these formerly redlined areas, in areas like a town like Gilpin that you see that was formerly redlined, it can be 5 to 20 degrees hotter than a non-redline neighborhood like West Overhill Park right here to the west. And this phenomenon is not just in Richmond. It's in many other cities, Dallas, Denver, even Baltimore, where I am currently living. And so when you see this, you think, okay, these are two different neighborhoods. So you have your Gilpin that was redlined. We can kind of guess who still lives in this neighborhood. It's almost 100% Black residents. Where West Over Hills, you see this really green, wonderful green space. It's almost 100% white residents. You see a definitely fivefold difference in income. But what you may not see or know is that there's definitely a 20-year difference in life expectancy. So a baby born in Gilpin has a 20-year less likelihood, or has likelihood of living 20 years less than a baby born in West Over Hills. And so these are differences where you can see related how health inequity is related to nature inequity. And so inequitable access to nature and natural environments is definitely, an issue. But sometimes, even when you are able to get to those areas, or those areas are available to people, there's still issues of racism that can occur within those spaces. And an example of this that we saw in the summer of 2020 was with Christian Cooper. This was a clear example that highlighted the issues of structural racism, exclusion, white privilege, and how these issues intersect with nature connectedness and health equity. And so I love this quote: systemic racism doesn't stop at the park gates. It was from Dr. Carolyn Finney, who's a cultural geographer, and she's really researched this area. And I think that is exactly something, because even if you can get access, you may not necessarily always feel welcomed in those spaces, or you may feel that this is not a space that was designed for you. And so many scholars, they've looked at these issues with impacts of nature access. So is there a park available to get to? But other scholars have really tried to look at the connection. So that natural kind of connection you feel with being in natural environments, particularly among communities of color. And a scholar by the name of Dr. Kimberly Smith, who's a professor of political science, has stated that human relationships with nature is really affected by the justice or injustice of their social surroundings. And other scholars have also argued that the racial oppression and slavery and other injustices have had a direct impact on African Americans' relation to and interaction with nature. And many of these nature policies have also impacted that subsequent connection. And so when we see, an image that actually was supposed to be in front of this, because this was another animated slide. It was an image of this really beautiful kind of lakefront. You saw the water, you saw the reflection of the water, and it was an area that was not too far from Annapolis. And it was an area where you saw that an individual had been lynched. And we see that that's not the only area. It's not just in Maryland. We see that, this kind of darkness that occurred in some of these most beautiful, majestic spaces is something that must be recognized. And again, at the beginning of the presentation, I said that between 1882 and 1968, there were over 3,400 African Americans who were lynched. And, 1968 is not that long ago. And so there's this kind of collective traumatic memory related to some of those spaces, because in many cases, these lynchings occurred in parks, occurred on farms, and occurred in these natural spaces. And so that darkness still lingers for some, and that kind of those tales of that darkness is subsequently told to the youth and the grandchildren. And so people know about it, even if they didn't experience it. And so we can't really move forward to achieve equity and justice related to nature and green space without bringing these past dark chapters to light. And if we talk about it and acknowledge it and begin to address the barriers to nature connection and access, we can start to move forward. Due to years of discrimination for many people, going out to parks or going to natural spaces feels like an effort. It feels like a burden, and it takes away that kind of enjoyment for the enjoyment of being within natural spaces, because they may feel I'm not welcomed, or they feel this is not a space that was designed for me. Or then many people may feel that, when they do go to those spaces, they may feel like a spotlight is on them with stares and questions and different attitudes. And so there's these microaggressions that some people may also experience. And so I think it's important to recognize this. And once we recognize it, we can move forward to kind of mitigating this and trying to figure out ways to reverse some of this. So I have talked about many of the racial injustices that occurred in this country, but I want to kind of end this presentation more on a positive note. And I believe that, when you achieve racial justice, you also achieve green justice and health justice. And you really can't achieve one without the other. And so in my small way, along with my colleague, Dr. Shannon Jetty, we've started Nature RX at UMD. And with Nature RX at UMD, our mission really is to highlight and leverage the natural spaces of our campus arboretum at the University of Maryland. And this is for the purpose of health, well-being, environmental stewardship, and to do this in the most equitable fashion. And what we have is kind of like four goals. We want to be able to prescribe nature. So a lot of this was born out of the park prescription movement. So we want to be able to give students prescriptions, so that they know this is a way that they can use to kind of maybe mitigate or, remedy some of the health issues that they may be dealing with. So along with prescriptions, we want to expand our nature-based education, pull from a variety of departments, landscape architecture, pull from urban planning, just a variety of different departments and schools throughout UMD. And then nature research is another goal of the program that will occur within the UMD as well as many of our affiliate universities that we work with and affiliate researchers throughout the country. And then finally, probably the goal that tugs at me the most is one of recognition and tribute. And our UMD campus, it lies on the indigenous tribal lands that were seized from the Piscataway people. And so I want to make sure that Nature RX recognizes Piscataway elders and brings to light the legacies of violence, displacement, land dispossession, and really, whether it's through education or other acts of true tribute, but I want to make sure this is definitely recognized. And along with the Piscataway people, I want to make sure that Nature RX is part of the conversation that acknowledges our campus's historic ties to the slave trade and engage in that conversation as a way of bringing levels of atonement and more importantly, ways to bring inclusivity to our African American students. And so this last slide, which is actually kind of out of order, I think this slide right here, this actually was going to be the closing slide that was really just a collage of images to represent many of the things that I discussed today, but it also was paired with the title song of the name of this presentation, The Secret Life of Plants. But I think you were able to hear the song on YouTube. So can't hear it right now, but you can definitely find it on YouTube. And so I want to thank all of you for your patience with some of the issues with animation and starting a little bit late. And hopefully, we can have a nice conversation and Q&A. And again, thank you for your attention. Stacia, you're muted.
Thank you. This is sort of the tech kind of day I'm having. When I was doing your introduction earlier, my dogs were going nuts in the living room. My neighbor decided to start mowing his lawn, and you handled out of order slides with just grace under pressure that I am in awe. And I can't apologize enough for some of the technological problems we had today. But thank you for that inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciate it. I do have a couple of questions in the chat. If I can go ahead and jump in. Okay.
Sure.
First, someone comments, nature can fix so many ills. Love this effort. And then the same person, Tammy, asked whether or not other areas are adopting your Nature RX.
Yes, definitely. So there, I think the website is called Campus Nature, Nature Campus, but there's many, I think at least probably 24 campuses, including Cornell, which was really one that we modeled our Nature RX program from. But many schools have adopted and created their own Nature RX programs throughout the United States. So this is definitely something that, thank you, definitely something that is growing, and it's really exciting because each year we have our conference, we have more and more schools who are trying to create a program, want to learn about creating a program, and each one kind of tailors it according to their particular region, which is nice because it's it flavors it based on wherever their university or their college is located. So yes, this is something that is continued to grow.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to read Stan's comment quasi question. On the one hand, can causal be an accumulation of correlative realities, e.g., food desert plus green desert plus limited health resources, limited plus poor job options, etc. A disparity does this with a disparity in life expectancy. Is one strategy for remediation a focus on creating a more natural green environment in neighborhoods historically ignored for healthy living?
Okay, so I'm going to break this up. So on the one hand, and I really stay away from the word causal, even though I do in just common technical terms. I mean, not technical, in just conversation, I'll say causal. But when I'm talking more epidemiological, research wise, I stay away from the word causal. But you are correct with the correlative reality. So it is an aggregate and a cumulative phenomenon. So a lot of times when you see areas that may be a food desert, they're also a green desert. They're also a transit desert. Like they just pile on top of each other. So you definitely have that whole aggregate. Then it's also cumulative because it didn't happen just yesterday. It happened generations ago. So it's continuing to go on and on. So all of that together contributes to what we call social determinants of life. So all of these things, from all these things, from the moment you're born, actually even before you, when you're in utero, all of these things impact your ability to have a healthy life. The last part of the question, I'm trying to figure out again. One strategy for mediation is to focus on, what's the last part?
To focus on creating a more natural green environment in neighborhoods historically ignored for healthy living.
I think so. I think we are starting to recognize the importance. Well, what a lot of the people have been saying for years and years, but we kind of just were ignoring them. The importance of green space, exposure to green space, and it doesn't have to be super super big, or it doesn't have to be so just like this massive. Like I'm going to the Grand Canyon or something. Like it just could be a small green space for people to get their senses stimulated, whether it's through sight or whether it's through smell, whether it's through sound with birds. So I think if we kind of focus on that, people have now started to take, abandoned parking lots. I'm like, what is the word? Parking lots, and convert them to parks. We've seen that in some urban areas, and they're not large, but they're just a small area. So I think if we're starting to, that is a remediation into focusing on having that green space, particularly in urban areas, so that there's that access and that constant exposure to green space. And also, too, to just add on one other aspect, it's just better in terms of, if we talk about climate crisis, because it can help with the urban heat island issues that we see a lot in these urban centers, where you have all these impervious surfaces that just get hotter and hotter because they don't have, any kind of greenery to absorb that solar energy. So yes, that is definitely a remediation.
Excellent. It's interesting that you bring up the urban heat island effect. When Tammy and I had a conversation about your presentation a few weeks ago and how excited she was for us to get to watch it. And that was right around the time that Los Angeles was experiencing 116-degree days, and how the asphalt was melting and students couldn't play outside because they were basically surrounded by lots of built environment.
Right, exactly.
So I have Eileen comments that this also works toward achieving several UN Sustainable Development Goals for a, quote, a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. So the Margot comments that this was fantastic. Looking forward to speaking with you in your office hours. And then Kathy asked, have you brought diverse groups of people together to work together, understand one another, acknowledge historical injustice, and identify common goals and agendas?
Yes, I have, in many different capacities. I mean, I can't help but to bring diverse groups, because I'm at a university campus that is international, and people from all walks of life, from rural areas, urban areas, different parts of the country. I mean, just all walks of life. And so I think one of the things that when they all come together and if they take my class or if they work in my lab, everyone's going to hear about this and going to learn about this, and then everyone wants to in their own kind of way figure out a way that they can address these issues. And so I like that because I really believe with the diversity of intellectual capital, you'll have different ideals that but I didn't even think about that. Or people bring together and there's a different level of empathy. I'll have students from, South Korea say, well, this is a situation that I've experienced and this may be different, but if you see the commonalities, and so, or some version of it ism. And so I think definitely bringing together diverse people is probably the first step in being able to address these issues.
That's wonderful. Though that is the, that's a great question from Faye. Can your University of Maryland class be audited from afar? For example, Philadelphia.
I think so. Yes. I would suggest you email me because I am so bad with the administrative stuff. I always have to go to the administration because I have the rules. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that it can be. But Faye, please reach out to me and we can uncover how that would happen.
That's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. Well, that is the end of our chat questions. We do have office hours starting in 8 minutes. And so I'll encourage our audience to go back to your agenda, click on the Zoom link, and it is a meeting format, so you'll be able to ask questions and have a conversation in person. Anyway, so Jennifer, thank you again. And what a terrific presentation, enlightening, insightful, and inspiring. So thank you very much.
Thank you. See you in a little bit.
Sounds good. Thanks.